Greetings. My name is Josh Williams. I'm coming to you from Skills International, where I'm a consultant here in New Zealand. I have 20 years experience here in the vocational education and training system, both on industry training side and the government side. And I really want to thank Lee and Associates for the opportunity to spend some time with you today. And I'm also looking forward, of course, to the live Q&A at the end of this presentation. So let me share my screen with you. And we'll begin. I've been asked to speak with you on a topic that's very common all around the world at the moment. And that is about the new normal, the next normal, what it means for skills and education and training in light of COVID-19, and in fact in light of a number of other disruptions that have been happening in the world of work now for some time. Because some of these conversations are not new, but they are certainly accelerated and amplified because of COVID-19. So certainly for the best part of a decade, we've been talking about Industry 4.0, the future of work, the impacts of technology change, of aging workforces, and automation in particular. That was certainly argued back and forth around what would be the impact on workers in the world of work. And there was strong debates about this on a global scale and in each country. Did it mean that all the jobs were going to disappear because the robots were coming? Did it mean that new jobs would be invented and new work take the place of the work that was being disrupted? What about globalization and the impacts of high levels of labour market mobility and migration when we are competing for skills, not just in our own country, but with all of the other countries as well? So these debates have been going on for a while, and as I say, there was not much agreement about how much the extent of the disruption would be, except where there was a consensus, was that the world of work would require lifelong upskilling and reskilling. That's the big change. And what I want to argue today is about what that looks like when you see technology change and you understand the need for dynamic workforces, dynamic careers, changing careers, and for the education and skills systems around the world to provide lifelong upskilling, continuous learning and continuous improvement in order to keep up with the changes and make sure that those workers can continue to thrive. And now, of course, we have COVID-19. And again, if there's a consensus, it's that COVID-19 has meant an acceleration and an amplification. These disruptions were already happening and were already going to happen, I think, in the 2010s, 2020s, the 10 years ahead. Now, suddenly we see all of this compressed. So I want to show you some examples of that. So firstly, I think it's important to realise the scale. And of course, COVID-19 is still emerging. In fact, case rates are not slowing down. And what we are seeing around the world is, something that's having an enormous impact on our workforces and a disproportionate impact on our young workforces. Young people are impacted by employment disruption in a much bigger way, more disproportionately than the population as a whole. But what we are looking at here is obviously unprecedented, much larger already than the employment disruption that we saw 10 years ago following the global financial crisis. And so just to give you some of the figures here, and I'm sorry if the translation isn't working quite right on the heading, but the International Labour Organization has calculated using its modelling that 400 million FTE of working hours have already been lost by the end of Q2 2020 this year. that's already a greater job loss than the entire global financial crisis and the recessions that followed that. And of course, as I've mentioned, they are particularly concerned about the impact on young people, less experienced workers, and in particularly young people that are just leaving schools and moving into the workforce now at a time when it's more difficult to find work. But of course, throughout the workforce, those FTE hours are real people that have lost real jobs, and in many instances, they've lost their way of making a living. So this is hugely concerning for economies and societies. And it seems, certainly in our country and in many, many places, that we know that education and training, and in particular job-related education and training, is going to be critical to those economic recoveries, but also to ensure that those people are able to adapt and to thrive in the labour market now. So in that regard, I do want to take us back and have a look globally at what labour markets are looking for. Manpower Global is one of the largest recruitment company on earth. It places around 600,000 people a day into jobs. And it's run a survey for the last 7 or 8 years on the jobs that are most in demand around the world. And what you'll see here from the result of the 2019 survey is that for 7 years now, the skilled trades are the number one sought skill set for workers globally. And that means two things. One is that people with those skills are globally in demand. That means that they can generally be portable on an international scale in terms of finding work offshore. But of course, that also means that when any country is looking to import those skills via migration, we are competing with the rest of the world when it comes to wages and conditions for those workers. Now, there's something else that I want to say that's extremely important about the skilled trades, which have come in number one for the last 7 years. And that is that they are geographically bound. They are sticky. They cannot be done on the internet. It is easier for a robot in another country to diagnose an X-ray or be a radiographer than it is for them to install your air conditioning system. And the reason for that is that the skilled trades make a real difference in the real world. You cannot be a skilled tradesperson on Teams. You cannot do these jobs over Zoom. That actually means that at a time where we're looking at a major disruption, that the skilled trades offer potentially quite a secure future for young and for old, in terms of jobs and work that needs to be doing. All countries, including ours, have got a lot of infrastructure work to do. And of course, the pandemic means that migration is curtailed significantly. People are not moving around as much, but people with the skills of the trades, of some of skilled trades and professions, these are jobs that are not easily converted into just being able to work from home or work over your internet connection. I think that's really worth pointing out as we think about what the next normal looks like. Of course, the second big element when we think about the future of work is aging workforces. And here is the breakdown for the 15 years between 2015 and 2030. So 10 years from now, would we look at Asian countries? And what we can see here is pretty simple. Everybody has an aging workforce. And in many of these countries, there is a significant percentage increase in the number of people aged over 60 in the next 10 years. So what that means is our overall workforce is getting older. That means that they tend to command more in terms of wages and salaries because they are more experienced workers. But what it also means is there may be a dip and a gap in terms of the skills in the supply chain, by which I mean young people or mid-career people, and ensuring that that succession in numbers of people to replace people as they leave the workforce are there. So we have to move smarter about that, but also it also tells us that there is going to be changes in the priority industries, particularly in the areas of aged care, healthcare, and human services as workers age and as workers leave the workforces. So again, I will show you now what New Zealand's experience looks like. And I want to relate the ageing workforce issue back to skills and training in a very particular way. In a lot of education systems for 30 years, we've been talking about the need for our systems to deliver lifelong learning. And this now seems extremely important, particularly as we see workforces aging. Here on the slide that you're looking at, in New Zealand, our largest group now is 70 years and older. And we certainly over the past 30 years have seen our workforce aging. But what it also means is if we look at our population as a whole and think about it from a labour force perspective or a human resources perspective, or even just training, where should we train people? If we look in the New Zealand situation, we're a small country, 5 million people, 60,000 young people a year leaving school. Well, 60,000 school leavers is not enough to fill the skills shortages that we have. Nowhere near. 60,000 would not even fill construction's problem, let alone all of the other industries in the workforce. We also have a group of young people, like all countries, who have left school but have not found their way. They've not made a successful transition to work. But again, there's 80,000 of those. And so 140,000 young people coming into the labour force. In our post-school system, our vocational education providers and our universities, we see another 350,000 people studying. And that's fine, but at the moment they are not necessarily in the workforce full-time, but they are part of the pipeline into the workforce. But again, the numbers are proportionately quite small when you look at the workforce itself, where we have 3.8 million people over the age of 15 years old, and 2.6 million under the age of 65. So there's our workforce. Now, if we do a quick thought experiment and we thought to ourselves, if we need to upgrade our whole workforce, and we know that that workforce is aging, and we know that there is rapid technology change, then how should our skills system invest and where should it invest? I'd like to think of it another way. If we filled up all of the training institutions in New Zealand, so all of the classrooms were completely full and everyone was training, would we be training enough people? No. So I think the big mind shift that is coming, that is happening, and that the model that the future of work demands is a big thinking shift that thinks of all of our workplaces, every single one of them, as a post-school learning institution, a place where learning can happen, a place where formal learning can happen. The technology change, the aging workforce, and COVID-19 mean that we have to become much more serious about the idea of lifelong learning. We cannot load skills onto people at a young age and expect them to be okay for a 40 or 50-year career, because that career is going to change so much. So we really need to think about how our education and training systems work in an integrated way with our employers, so that we're reskilling and retraining and redeploying people. So education and training is an industry like any other industry. And so these changes in technology apply to the education sector as well. And COVID-19 certainly, as you can see from this data from McKinsey and Company, the future of work has accelerated in the education sector as well. I will just point to one statistic there that just relates to China, is that in the first 2 weeks of the COVID pandemic, in terms of the lockdowns, 250 million people went online. Now again, online learning is certainly something that our education providers have been moving into and increasing over the last 10 and 20 years as the technology has allowed. But now it is the main event. Online learning, particularly in the COVID environment, is the primary way that people are accessing learning. Here in New Zealand, our education providers are now required by government to be able to switch to online learning within 24 hours notice. The second element, as I've said, is learning in and through work. And particularly in a time where we're looking at downturns and we're needing to make sure that the skills of our workforce are being worked on, is that training people through their jobs means that they both have a labour market outcome and an education outcome at the same time. Earn and learn through the economy, learn in the economy, not outside the economy. COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the switch to online learning has also, I think, really awakened the idea that learning does not have to happen in a classroom. And again, this was a trend that was already happening, but is now right here, right now. Particularly in the case of industry training and vocational education and training, that the theoretical learning can underpin on-job and practical learning, but it can be delivered in an online way, on demand, in a convergence between online learning and practical on-the-job learning, and that's quite exciting. And again, as I've mentioned, I think for any country that's thinking about how it wants to recover from COVID-19, those notions of retaining, so policies that help people to stay in work, retrain. We know that people are going to need to change careers and sometimes change whole industries. So thinking about what helps them become adaptable in those workforces and retraining into that space. It's a combination of general and technical education. And redeploy. And we've got efforts here and in many other places around that too. Again, we knew that the future of work was going to bring this over the next 10 years. It's just that with COVID, it has to happen all at the same time. And so we know that there's a need to have good tools. And again, technology is assisting this to help people to match their experience to skills, to turn their skills into formal credentials that can be recognized by other employers. And so that rather than doing a whole big new piece of education, we can be augmenting people's skills, recognizing what they've already got and adding to it so that the system really provides that lifelong learning. I do want to say one thing about technology change, because sometimes we can talk about it as if it's all one thing. That, technology is changing and robots are coming and automation is coming. And of course, that is all true. But things don't all change at the same rate. So here on the screen, it's very simple. I have two computers. One on the left is a computer from 1955, and the one on the right is a computer from 2020. And as you can see, the computer has changed an awful lot. And the skills to use that computer have changed a lot. And are much now more widespread in the population than a very small team of specialists that would have used those machines in 1955. Here is another example. On the left, a hammer from 1955, and on the right, a hammer from the year 2020. Now, what I hope everyone can notice is that the hammer has not changed very much at all. Conceptually, it's the same thing, it does the same job. And while, of course, in the construction industry now, they have more technologies for sticking things together and fastening, like nail guns, still a carpenter needs to be able to use a hammer. You wouldn't be a very good carpenter if you couldn't use a hammer. So I just want to make a quick point about that, because it's very easy to talk about technology change as if automation is all happening at once and all at the same speed. And of course it isn't. And I'll repeat my point from before about the skilled trades, where actually the skills to execute solutions in the real world actually don't necessarily change as fast is the technology change in the information universe, or software, or computers, or the IT industry. So I just think it's worth noticing that the skills to get jobs and keep jobs are also things that don't change necessarily as quickly as the tools and techniques in the industries themselves. And I want to kind of use a little bit of time to show the New Zealand experience with its apprenticeship system over the last 10 years. And that's the years that covered the last global financial crisis through to a couple of years ago. And we experienced a downturn there. Like many countries, the global financial crisis put New Zealand into a recession. And what we saw was the number of our apprentices, which in our population sat at around 50,000 people, almost halved. Very, very quick drop in the 2 years following the global financial crisis. So those numbers went down significantly, and significantly quickly. And this is, of course, a real shame, because it's easy for employers to say, well, we've got a downturn, so the work has slowed down, so we can't, training is a cost, and I don't necessarily see the return on investment for me, so I can't do that now. But actually, that's a mistake, because, of course, the skills is a supply chain like anything else. And unless we continue to maintain that training, and in fact, for downturns, unless we are investing in people's skills, we're not in a position to recover well when the economy improves. So in New Zealand, yes, the economy improved significantly. Prior to the COVID pandemic, our unemployment rate was 3.2%, very, very low. And we were struggling to find enough skilled people, skills shortages across the economy. But it's worth noticing that as that picked up, it took a much longer time for the number of apprentices to come back on. And in fact, it was only 2018. It took 10 years for the numbers to get back to where they were. And so one of the messages there, I think, for our country, and it seems that this lesson has been learned, our government is very invested in trying to make sure that we retain the apprentices we have in the system at the moment, even during a time of a downturn. Because in fact, downturns are when employers have more time to train people, and trainees are not the most expensive of their employees. So, it requires support, particularly from government, and it requires a big effort from the private sector too. But we're all making an effort to try and deal with this virus. And it feels to me that part of that effort has to be around ensuring that we're making sure that the education and training through our workplaces continues even through the hard times. And so that does bring me to young people. I started out by talking about the fact that when we've seen economic shocks in the past, like the global financial crisis, young people bear the brunt of this worse. That's because they have less experience to rely on or to fall back on. But when the job market is tough, when young people leave school and there's no jobs to go to, that's very difficult for them. And again, economically, we see that can stay with them and hold them back for a long period of time. So we are now looking at a generation that, I hope we don't see a lockdown generation, where the young people in this year who've had education affected, but they're going into a labour force which isn't that welcoming. There aren't the number of jobs. So we really, again, need to focus on them and on the policies that help them to find pathways and transitions and support them to train and get them into work so that they can be earning and learning. So I do want to talk a little bit about the skills that employers say that they look for, they are looking for when they talk about young people. Because in vocational education, one of the big debates again and big discussions has been around soft skills, employability, core capabilities. Again, because the technology and techniques change so fast, what we need is people who can learn and who can adapt and have the attitude, which means that they can learn in the first place. Now, what is really important in that situation to notice is that actually the skills that employers want tend to be about the behaviours of people in workplaces. And actually, that's not very easy to develop in a classroom, in a school classroom. You can't necessarily transfer what happens in classrooms into what happens in workplaces. So I think there's just an important role here for the employer to participate in the process of helping a young person to become employable. So they know what it's like to be in a workplace, and they know what employers' expectations are when they are in those workplaces. So for example, an employer will say, I want young people who turn up on time. But actually turning up on time is something that you need to see in your own workplace. And so for me, the real solution to transitions between school and work is for all young people, from the most academic to the least academic, to have the opportunities to meet employers and to experience real workplaces. They need to try out different industries to see what works for them, what their own strengths and interests relate to. And I think employers have a big role in that. Certainly in a number of places, employers can say, oh, well, when will the schools just produce perfect young people that can come out and just work in any employer? Well, of course, that can't happen. Those young people need to show that they've got work skills in workplaces. So the soft skills that employers are looking for are best developed in a real workplace. And they can only be demonstrated in a real workplace. So it seems to me that in those final couple of years, while young people are starting to think about where they want to move into in the world, that employers have a real role to work with the schools and work with those communities around showing young people those experiences, because that will lift their employability skills. Ideally, we talk a lot about transitions. I sometimes like to say that if we got this right from the young person's perspective, it would feel like no transition. It would be seamless. In a year of school, they would try out something in agriculture and they would like it. And then the following year, maybe they spend 3 days a week at school and 2 days a week working in agriculture. And then it just seamlessly moves through into the beginning of that career in agriculture, having already met an employer, having already known that they like the work. And so there is no shock at the point where the young person leaves school and then moves into the workforce. We try and make that as much as possible seamless from the young person's point of view. So I just wish to make a couple of points in concluding around where we are at now and what I think it looks like going forward. We are learning, of course, in all countries a lot about the virus. It's still an enormous big deal and things are still being learned. We all hope for a vaccine, but even if there isn't a vaccine, we'll all need to learn ways to manage and move around safely. And in particular, that works for those jobs where you cannot do it on a computer. That I think the demand for skilled trades, as in the Manpower Global Survey, will still be there. And it will be interesting to see what its next survey looks like in the age of COVID. And that the future of work has arrived and accelerates the need to be serious about making sure education and training systems join up with industries to offer lifelong learning that supports a person throughout their career. Work-based learning keeps people working and improving productivity. That means they are contributing to the real economy at the same time as they are learning. It's not learn then work, it's work and learn and work at the same time. Deploying skills as they are developed, creating that resilient workforce. And I want to end on a couple of silver linings from the COVID experience. It seems to me that a virus recession is very different from a GFC credit recession. In our country and in many countries, there is so much work to do, infrastructure that needs to be developed. The work is still there waiting to be done, and demand for those skilled people will accelerate fast. I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the chance to have a conversation. Thank you.